Let's see. Welcome everybody to the Regeneration Podcast. We're recording on October 30th, and usually Michael Martin, because he's tied to the land, has a little bit of an update on what's going on with regenerative agriculture, biodynamic agriculture in southern Michigan. What's going on, my friend?
Today I went out to frost, which is about normal.
Killer frost?
It wasn't a hard frost, but it was a little bit of frost. Mm-hmm. The day after Michaelmas, which, we had our big Michaelmas festival here on the farm on
Tell us how it went.
It was great. I was surprised that a lot of people showed up, and it was, sketchy weather. It looked like it was going to rain. In fact, there was intermittent rain throughout the day. So one of my friends who showed up, we're using the Cloudbuster. And I said, I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no. Okay. Just to know. But it was nice. It was very nice. Maybe about 35 people were here.
I think that's great.
A few children.
Yeah. There's no way to regenerate the liturgical year, the year of festivals, without doing it on your own. I give you a lot of credit for single-handedly just starting Michaelmas and May Day festivals in your yard.
Yeah, so what we did, pardon me, is we had this like a parade with a dragon. All the children are the dragon. In fact, my two youngest sons and I made a really cool dragon head out of paper mache, and the skin is basically sheets painted green and other things, which all the other children were behind. And then we had Saint Michael, who slew the dragon.
Did he win again this year? I hope so.
He wins every year.
Awesome. I get nervous every year.
And then we had this big feast kind of thing, potluck, and people were drinking my mead.
Awesome.
That's really strong, what I told you about. Which was, we sang. And we sang a song. I'll just do a little bit of it. Mark knows. Our guest today, Mark Vernon, and you probably know Mike.
What?
And it goes like this. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's ground, and was the Lamb of God on his presence. Shine forth upon our crowded hill, and was Jerusalem among these stars of heaven. And it goes on, of course, to a second verse, which answers all the questions. And
great.
Why did I mention that? Because Mark, like Mike and myself, is a huge fan of the patron saint of Jesus the Imagination, William Blake.
Yeah, we'll mention that Michael Martin. We didn't mention this, Mark, and I'll introduce you a little more fully. That Michael's the editor, and I'm a frequent contributor to a journal he started, kind of to the arts and imagination, called Jesus the Imagination. So, jumping right in, I'm going to welcome our guest, Mark Vernon, all the way from the UK. Mark is a writer and a commentator, and I'm reading off the bio of his an excellent book that could be several podcasts in itself. Owen Barfield, I'm just so conversant with him, and we'll get to why for some reason I wanted to talk to you about William Blake mostly, but the secret history of Christianity. Mark is a writer, a commentator, and a psychotherapist, contributing to and presenting programs on BBC Radio, as well as writing for the national and religious press and online publications like Aeon. More on that and on from me. He has a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy and other degrees in physics and theology, having studied at Durham, Oxford, and Warwick universities. Author of several books, including The Meaning of Friendship, God, the Big Questions, The Idler Guide to Ancient Philosophy, and more, and a most recent one on Dante. Welcome, Mark Vernon.
Hey, look, thank you very much. And greetings from William Blake's land. Not just England's green and pleasant land, but actually I live in South London, within walking distance of Lambeth, where he and Catherine lived for probably their happiest years.
Walking distance.
Yeah, so I partly got into Blake because I feel like he's our local mystic, and wanted to understand him better.
And I'm correct in saying you've not written a book on Blake. Do you plan to write a book on Blake? You're so excellent on him, and I'll say more about that.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I've been, reading and thinking and doing a podcast, and then this essay, which you mentioned, and it's my way of seeing whether I really feel I can get to the heart of what he's on about, which isn't straightforward actually, and
to say the very least.
Then whether I feel I can actually write about it at book length, which of course is something else again.
Right,
but I'm getting there, feeling maybe I can. So
I hope you do, because you don't seem repetitive at all, and I think you have a book's worth of insights. There's one place in one article I read too, and you've read more of the secondary literature, and I'll mention a little bit to my interest in you and Blake. The secondary literature I've read, and I almost think everybody reads a lot of secondary literature because the material is so difficult, would be Peter Ackroyd's biography. And then I've mentioned in this podcast before, I'm probably on my 4th round of reading Northrop Frye's book, Fearful Symmetry. And then your stuff online, it seems irreplaceable for me. And 2 things. One is your background in theology and the fact that you're a psychotherapist. To me, when I wonder why this guy, Mark Vernon, seems to be able to make things so clear that are so difficult, I swear that has to do with the psychotherapist meets religion piece. But you also say, and I just don't know enough to know this, that many writers miss the spiritual component a lot. Is that a fact? It seems to me incomprehensible that you could read Blake without the spiritual component. Now, again, Northrop Frye had a degree in divinity and was a minister. You have backgrounds in theology. Begin by saying a little bit about that. Then I'm going to seed you with some of the ways we're going to unpack Blake this morning.
Yeah, look, just one more person that I should mention, because she's been very influential, is Kathleen Rayne, the poet. Of course. And she probably understood Blake even more than Northrop Frye.
Okay.
Northrop Frye is brilliant, but sometimes his book can be almost as complicated as Blake's poetry. But Kathleen Rayne had a way of penetrating through to the heart of Blake, I think. So I said, and you can listen to talks of hers as well as read her books as well. So she's really good.
Yeah, so important to mention her.
Yeah. But yes, I kind of I think that Blake, he wants to awaken us again to the inner life, not just of the psyche, the personal psyche, but the inner life of the whole world. So trying to sort of use the organs of perception that you develop as a psychotherapist, but through particularly Blake's poetry, to see whether you can follow his golden thread, and feel what he saw, I think, quite routinely. And what it means for now. He's also a very sharp thinker, so that appeals to me too. There's another side of him that's often lost. His couplets can be sort of, they belie the amount of thought that goes into them, I think, and then bang, he hits the nail on the head again. So it's the religious side, but also him as a thinker. He's often talked about as a great political figure, and and Did Those Feet in Ancient Land is a great political anthem, often sung as, and then also as a great creative, and how his imagery has sparked 1,000 comic strips and whatever else, but I think that people, because they're in his sort of single vision or maybe dual vision, they just perhaps even don't see the religious side to him, extraordinarily odd though that can sound. I mean, people do the same with Dante, actually. Last year was the 700th anniversary of Dante's Divine Comedy, and in a leading magazine here in the UK, they had a kind of front page cover story on Dante, and the academic that wrote it even made the comment at one point, some people say Dante's Divine Comedy is a religious text, as if this was, a sort of footnote that you might want to pick up if you're that way inclined.
Talk about burying the lead, as they say, right?
I know, and it's not like these guys hide it in metaphor. Both Dante and Blake say this is about finding heaven or Jerusalem or whatever, So yeah, it's part of this. I think it must just wash over people, and because they don't know what to make of it, they hardly even notice that it's there. It's quite a big comment, I think, actually, on what it is to live in a very secular age like ours.
Yeah, and you mentioned awakening, that you also say, and it's a really concise summary of even maybe the way Michael and we haven't talked about this, but the way we are, almost trying to change the musical register of the way people feel religion, but you'll say that Christianity, or Blake will say, it's not about sin, it's about sleep, right? And there again is this notion of awakening as opposed to doing like right and wrong, foundational to William Blake. Michael, jump in here a little bit. Then we're going to set off Mark Vernon on some of his this stuff he does so well.
Well, what really strikes me, and I think Mark's the perfect person to talk to about this. One thing we mentioned last time in our introduction to William Blake is what a tremendous psychologist he was. And we talked in Jerusalem in particular, even in the Songs of Innocence and Experience, where he examines the same question from two different perspectives very often. But in Jerusalem, with the tearing off of the specter and the tearing off of the emanation, which is, when you read it, really attentively, I would get chills reading it, because it felt like it was something going on inside of me. And I could identify with. You can see why so many Jungians read Blake and they look at him and think, "Wow, this guy got it. He's exactly describing what happens with the projection of the anima, for instance, or whatever it happens to be." But to me, and I think Peter Ackroyd, I saw an interview with him. He thinks William Blake was the most brilliant man ever to come out of Britain, which I think there's a case to be made for that. And
certainly, I think.
Or my doctorate is in British literature and in poetry in particular, but I would be hard pressed to find someone more extraordinary than William Blake, who is almost entirely ignored in his lifetime, which is shocking.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned Peter Ackroyd, because his biog there, which you say is a must-go-to text. But actually, I really like Peter Ackroyd too, because although I don't think he knows quite what to make of the religious side of Blake, but nonetheless, he is open to it, and he doesn't try to argue away the fact that Blake, lived with the dead and with the angels, with all sorts of things like that. He's quite open to all that, actually. And so at least he doesn't just close it down or say, if only Blake was put in a brain scanner, we'd understand what was going on, which is what a lot of people today say.
Yeah.
I'm almost getting chills with this conversation again, because
it's
you're so good on this.
It's as though people want to psychoanalyze Blake when actually what he's doing is psychoanalyzing us.
Right. And looking at Blake through the realm of Ulro, should be a whole book on Blake, of all these people who are missing the thing that's right there. So, on that note, going through your work, Mark, your videos, and I hope at a time, your language best, because you're kind of on YouTube. There's some written things. I'm going to mention an article in Aeon magazine that's seminal. But what I think you do so many things so well with William Blake. And again, we're not even touching your book on Barfield that I feel is monumental and so forth, is that you take these 4 states of awareness, these 4 states of existence for William Blake: Ulro, Generation, Beulah, and Eden. And then only this morning, revisiting so much of your work and your essays, did I realize, and it's so useful for young people or anybody, to see how they're kind of states of awakening, and that to see how you use these states of awareness to say how differently we can look at certain things like death, the whole ecology movement, the way we look at the material universe, and the way we look at freedom. I want to throw it to you, Mark, first. I mentioned 4: death, ecology, material universe. In order to get your pumped prime, did you want to launch out on one of those that's just kind of something that feels like you would like to explain it to us?
Yeah, so this is my way of, not just mine actually, but it's one way of trying to put together a framework when you're reading, say, the epic poem Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, which Michael referenced there, in order to have a bit of a map to at least then try and get in direct contact with the terrain of the poem, if you like. So it's always a bit artificial with Blake, because ultimately he wants you to be absolutely in contact with reality and moving with the reality around you, which I think is why his poems can be so confusing because they're not. It's Dante's Divine Comedy it's a difficult text, but at least the story. It begins in hell, goes through purgatory, up to paradise, kind of thing, and that can keep you going. Whereas with Blake, particularly the epic poems towards the second half of his life, they're moving around quite as much as one's own mind can move around. But he's always wanting us to. It's almost like a training, I think. I mean, he does say, "I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It'll lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall." And so he really is wanting to cleanse the doors of perception, so use another well-known phrase. In a way, I think when you can read a poem like Jerusalem and be with it every step of the way, is probably when you're seeing what Blake saw directly yourself. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that but there are these four kind of, as you say, stages of awakening that he often refers to, and they're sometimes known as single vision, twofold vision, threefold vision, fourfold vision as well. And the all-rose state, if it's useful just to give a very short sort of summary, is where everything is abstract. Everything is numbers, statistics, and in a way, it's the state which is out of touch with reality, in the sense that it's confused the abstract with reality itself. And the famous images that he has of that are either of a kind of
Newton, of course,
God, Urizen, or Newton. He blames Newton a lot, probably unfairly actually, but nonetheless he blames Newton a lot. And where the map with the compasses open on the map are the complete preoccupation, and you've almost sort of forgotten that you're in the living world. And scientism would be the way we might put that now.
I have a literary hero friend who died recently, Stephen Vizenci, who actually lived in London. But he had a great phrase that I thought got the distinction between oro and vision. But he said, it's like confusing a woman's glance with saying she had 20/20 vision. A woman's glance at her husband when you're in the doghouse is relational. It's filled with emotional content, and then reducing it to saying she had 20/20 vision is a great example. It captures this notion of reducing something to oro.
Yeah. I mean, a quick example, which I've used in the essay as well, is how you see the sun in these different states of awakening. Because
say everything about that.
Yeah. So Blake's well known for saying, having this conversation with himself one day when someone hypothetically asks him, what do you see when you see the sunrise? Do you see a guinea, a golden guinea? It looks like a sort of small disc in the sky. And Blake replies, no, I see the heavenly hosts crying, holy, holy, holy. So how you see the sun is quite a good measure of where you are on these stages of awakening. And in the all-rose state, it would be just described a bit like in a kind of catalogue of stars by an astronomer. It would be like an E-type average yellow star halfway through its lifetime in an inconsequential part of the Milky Way galaxy. It would be pretty uninteresting and dull, really. Just one of countless stars like that. That's how Allro would categorize our star. Whereas generation, the next stage, and the other thing that's really nice about Blake is that there's instabilities within all these stages, so that if you can track the instability, which is sort of to undergo the crisis and the suffering associated with each stage, it can lead you to the next. And the obvious one with a statistical life is actually a dead life when you're actually alive. So it's, one way or another, it leads you.
Our fascination with zombies, right, Mark?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's a very good point. Yes. Sort of projecting out our all-rose state onto these.
The world is all-ro and all we do is watch zombie movies. You have to look in the mirrr. Yeah.
But in generation, life starts to reappear, but it's quite a sort of biological life, and hence the notion of generation. It's mostly interested in replication, self-sustaining, safety. So you might say a lot of our anxiety about death, which we've become so conscious of through COVID, we're trying to wrestle with that in a generation state. And so the medicalization of the problem becomes the absolutely fundamental and crucial approach. And in terms of seeing the sun in generation, you start to clock that energy comes from the sun, and that energy comes to earth and causes life, And so you might start to get concerned about things like pollution. But again, it would still be in a very scientific sort of frame, quite instrumental. The sun would be treated as, we needn't worry about the sun burning out because it's still got billions of years to go, but we might worry about the sun overheating the planet through global warming. Those kind of concerns would come to the fore in generation. But we are meaning-seeking creatures, and the sun doesn't just provide us with energy and heat, but it kind of looks beautiful. Few people would deny that the sun can look beautiful. And so that's leading us into what Blake called Beulah. And Beulah, the word comes from the Hebrew Bible, where one of the prophets says, my land shall be called Beulah. And it's a state where the meaning of things, the soulfulness of things comes to the fore. So you'll want to look at a beautiful image of the sunset, and you'll say, what an amazing thing that this object in the sky, that's otherwise just an astronomical body, nonetheless seems to look so wonderful and inspire so much poetry. And, people feel better when they're warmed by the sun. So this sort of is going on in the state of Beulah. But Beulah is also quite a dreamy state. So it pulls you towards the fourfold vision. Almost in your dreams about the sun, you might say, you wonder, is there more that I can know about this as well? That'd be one facet of Beulah. And so that would lead to Blake's notion of eternity, or Eden, he sometimes calls it as well. And this is fourfold vision. And this is when to cut to the chase, not just the sun, but in everything, you can see the divine presence. Mm-hmm. And so hence him seeing the heavenly host crying, holy, holy, holy. One way or another, you are able to perceive, and it's perception that counts so much for Blake, I think, that the divine life is shining, radiating, reaching you, but also welling up from within you. And the sun, hence sings to him, even as he's singing of the sun, and so on. So there's these kind of four stages, from the cosmos being dead to the cosmos being fully alive, and then how you move through them and what it takes to develop, particularly the imagination, in order to get the movement, and then receive, as well as participate in these different awarenesses of things. That's one way of trying to get into Blake.
Yeah, no, fascinating. And I think we're gonna have you sing that tune again for Death. But Michael, you'd be no foreigner to this. We met probably through my review of your book called The Submerged Reality, and I wrote a review of that. And again, what I appreciated in your use of sophiology and that book was that you would even find in von Balthasar, but certainly Rudolf Steiner and others, that Christianity, Michael, in your own work, ties into perception, right? Instead of this bland theology, how about a theology that raises perception? We can see these things. It's not this blind faith,
And I'm sure, that seed was planted by William Blake when I read Jerusalem when I was 22.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then later confirmed by Thomas Traherne.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think he sees the same thing that Blake sees, I think.
Yeah, no, it's very true. Yeah. No, he's not nearly so well known as Blake, but definitely is onto the same thing. Yeah, and seeing Christianity in that way very much too.
Yeah, again, not about sin, because Blake, use your own words, Mark, about distinguishing a religion that's looking at sin and not sin, moral codes, right and wrong, versus a way, maybe a cultivation practice that's about waking up,
So this is where Blake starts to get a bit challenging rather than just seeming rather lovely.
It's always an understatement when we say Blake gets a bit challenging.
Yeah, because one of the things which he's really against is morality. Mm-hmm. He talks about the wastes of the moral law. And the reason why he's so against this is because he's seen in his time, and I think this is very dominant still in a lot of Christianities that I come into contact with, where it's reduced to a kind of ethical framework. Mm-hmm. And it wastes life because it becomes a question of living by the rule or avoiding guilt, or doing what you kind of feel you ought to do because there's an ideal version of you somewhere in front of you that you're constantly failing to reach. But the complication is that, of course, morality ethics arises with very good intent because it seeks to preserve that which it perceives to be good. But it's very different from trying to preserve something which becomes desperate one way or another, as opposed to participating in it. And so knowing it directly as part of your immediate life. When in a way, morality ceases to matter because the good, the beautiful, and the true has kind of come together in your being. That's one of the places where he starts to get awkward because, you know, for a lot of Christians, and for good reason too, things like social justice, you know, how you behave, you know, even, you know, references like love thy neighbor can be reduced to moral imperatives. Whereas I think what Blake would say Jesus was really saying when he said things like love thy neighbor, is can you see the divine in them as much as the divine in you? So again, it's really a question of perception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think St. Augustine, when he wrote that love God and do what you will, there should have been a footnote, see William Blake for more. Right? Because it's what he's doing. And I think we talked last week, you know, the line from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell that prisons are built with the stones of law and brothels with the bricks of religion. That's what he's talking about, is how the visionary impulse gets distorted by the imposition of rules or laws, which then become perverted on themselves. They kind of get turned on themselves, and they create the very thing we were trying to avoid. And I think you see, I mean, one place, Mike and I come from a Catholic background, one place you see this, you know, unvarnished is in the pre-sex scandal, right? It's what happens. I mean, it's an infantilization of people, and Blake was asking us to learn how to see instead how to read the law, and instead of doing midrash, to actually have immediate vision, immediate experience. And I think that's a challenge, but I think it's both, and like you said, there are dangers implicit there for people who aren't quite up to the task, you know, who you know, we saw this in the 17th century with the antinomians, right, where they just thought everything, you know, all the law doesn't matter, the law was displaced, and so they were engaging all kinds of despicable behavior. And then, but Blake is coming from a different place, and as we know, as much as he didn't like that kind of conventional morality, he still practiced it, you know.
Yeah.
You know, people talk about him as a possible free love. Well, in theory he was, but he wouldn't do that to his wife, right? To Catherine.
No, I think that you're right. It's good to bring up
he's a complicated.
Sorry, Michael, I was jumping in there, but I don't want to lose the antinomian moments. I think that's a really important point you make there. Yeah, he's not an antinomian. You know, he'll say, you know, like in another phrase, every kindness is a little death. So he's absolutely clear that kindness, forgiveness, compassion, and so on, love are absolutely crucial. But because they take you out of yourself and so make you realize there's more than yourself. So again, it's a perceptual drive that makes these things really crucial, not a moral imperative. And I think that all that stuff about, you know, was Blake members of the, you know, Moravian free love sect or whatever, you know, those things were around, I don't doubt that, but it's to try and put him into a box, I think, that often happens when people conclude that he must have been doing that as well, and completely misunderstands what he's actually driving at.
Isn't it true too? You know, there's a couple things. One is that it might have been E.P. Thompson, one of the great British historians, you know, I guess wrote a book on Blake, and I think I read a lot of it, but he, you know, in a materialist view of history, so I'm going to say this was communist, not as a point to denigrate him, you know, but a materialist worldview trying to explain Blake, who is sui generis, just tried to find the lineage that could describe Blake and ultimately failed, right? And I love that so much, looking at the brethren and so forth, or the Muggletonians, and seeing if that could describe where he was. But related to this is there's always been a little gem, and there's many of them in the Catholic tradition, but St. John of the Cross, and I don't know if I have the wording exactly right, he said, it's not our virtues and our vices that define us. It's our distance between it's our distance from our virtues and our vices, right? That kind of gives us the freedom. So this thing has always been there since the gospel. But again, we get so nervous. But, bringing in, Mark, what Michael was saying and about the antinomians, let's say I don't know if you still do private practice with psychotherapy. How do you work with this for somebody who's bound? So I in the Catholic faith, if I took 5 young people who expressed interest in joining the Catholic faith, 4 are severely obsessive compulsive disorder, like a clinical. How do you, as an individual, if somebody was looking at themselves being kind of burdened by the moral code, and again, somebody who really suffers with OCD looks at the Catholic faith, and it's an attraction like flies to shit, right? There's this thing that will tell me to say these prayers on a Monday, these prayers on a Friday, and these at this time. How do you guide somebody from sleeping to awakening, or from slavery to freedom? I'm asking you, that's a big question. I hadn't formulated it well because I hadn't thought of it, but it's so urgent for young people today. So if you could wax on that in some way.
Well, I mean, I'm guiding someone from slavery to freedom. I wouldn't want to claim that. But accompanying people when they try, to find what that might look like, yes. And I think actually on this psychotherapy, on the whole, I mean, psychotherapy is a pretty diverse thing, but certainly the way that I think about it is actually quite aligned to Blake's understanding of the gospel at this point, because another quote, which you'll no doubt know, is words to the effect of, I know only one gospel, the forgiveness of sins. And I think what Blake means here is that you're forgiven. That's the starting point. It's not like something that comes down the line if you do the right things or attend the right rituals or go to confession or whatever. No, you're already forgiven. The question is, what are you going to do now? And psychotherapy is quite like that in a way, because someone will come and maybe either be suffering from guilt or maybe even have done bad things, and you're saying, look, for this hour that we're talking, that's forgiven, but because that creates the space to try to understand what's going on and how you are enslaved or trapped, or what's holding you in these kind of vices, and with that possibility of understanding, seeing again, it's seeing with the inner eye, comes the possibility of awakening, and new virtues being kindled, and so the path to freedom might be found. So yeah, I think that it's confusing this in the church, isn't it? Because sometimes, I mean, I've asked priests about this, and sometimes they'll say, well, that's why the confession's at the beginning of the service, because you receive the forgiveness and then off you go into the praise and whatever else. And so, but I'm not sure it quite functions like that in people's minds. Just so much in terms of church going can reinforce the sense that you've sort of fallen short, and you've got to kind of deal with the falling short again and again and again and again. And Blake would say, no, you've got to move on from that. And this is partly what he's trying to foster in his poetry and so on as well.
That's his starting point. That's one of my takeaway. The first time I read Jerusalem all those years ago was that it was a book about forgiveness. Because I mean, he brings in all the people who were his enemies in real life, or who felt persecuting him, or even who brought him to court, and they're all brought together in the tremendous act and movement of forgiveness. And I was mentioning last time, maybe Mark knows these people. Remember, Mike, I was talking about there was this group trying to put this film together about Blake. I found it
Yeah,
finally.
yeah. Okay.
In Sussex is the project. Do you know about this, Mark?
No, I don't know.
They have, because I maybe 2 years ago I found this beautiful little 1 minute, 2 minute clip that they made, I think, to promote the financing of Blake's little boy.
So many
Going through a
films start and end at that stage, though,
Going,
right?
going through a field near Lambeth when he has the vision of the tree full of people. It's extraordinary. And I hope they make the film, because my God, isn't this the film we need today? A film about, no one's made anything decent about William Blake, and you would think this is such rich territory for cinematography alone, right? So now that they have the CGI, they represent some of those visions. But it's, yeah, check it out. So it's Blake in Sussex. They have a website or a YouTube page.
Yeah. And Mark, regarding this forgiveness piece too, you had mentioned the one quote from Blake, the other one, and I probably have them mixed up, the bread and the wine, but I forgive you, you forgive me. This is the bread, this is the wine. The Catholic Church is going through in the U.S. this 3 year of Eucharistic revival. I can go off on it. You have the priest scandals, and then the answer is more priestcraft, possibly, right? But let's give it a favorable interpretation. Could you flesh that out for somebody, like how that forgiveness piece ties into the Eucharist? You were once a vicar in the Anglican Church.
Yes. I mean, in relation to Blake, I think that he would say the fix that certainly sacramental churches have got themselves into is that they've forgotten that the sacraments, particularly of communion, bread and wine, should be a prompt to remember that everything is sacramental. And the priest, in a way, is there to say you don't actually really need a priest. I'm just here to
amen.
I perform a few rituals that bless these particular things, but that's only to show you that everything is blessed already. Yeah. And that's again quite a challenging thing to say.
That's where I always quote Charles Williams quoting Coventry Patmore, that the Eucharist was a meal so that every meal might become a Eucharist, right?
Yeah. And again, a lot of people might say, oh, no, that's absolutely right. But do they really kind of follow that through? I think I don't know quite how it is in the Catholic Church, but certainly in the Anglican Church, Church of England, I think in retrospect, what was called the Parish Communion or the Parish Eucharist movement, I think it was, where the idea was that every Sunday would become a Eucharist. And the idea was that this would become much more participative and so on. And so it has a good impulse. But it's become a bit of a sort of monocrop Christianity now, where all you do is kind of take communion and then take communion again and take communion again. Sorry, that sounds a bit derogatory, but
no, it's spot on, sadly. Yeah.
But I think we need another thing that Blake's really good at, which I don't know if you've heard this expression. It's been used a bit here by some people. Is to rewild Christianity, and by that they mean to get. But it's a bit like you were talking about at the beginning there, Michael. For remembering Michaelmas is to remember the stories, to remember the local myths, to go to the Holy Well, to light the fires, to keep the angels commemoration days, and to diversify again and start to realize that that's the ways in which God is found everywhere, not just through this one particular act.
Well, I wrote a couple blog posts about this maybe a year or two ago about rewilding the church. And often, if you probably know this, a lot of people interpret rewilding the church as not cutting the grass around the parish.
Yeah, regenerative agriculture around the parish church.
Okay, it's a nice thing. Yeah. It's a nice move. I appreciate that, but that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah, so it's, and I think I'm totally with you on this, Mark. I mean, this is what I've been working toward for, I don't know, since I started thinking about writing the Submerged Reality. Which really came out of my study of 17th century sociology of Burma and the Philadelphian Society and so forth. And Henry Vaughan and Thomas Vaughan. And I remember thinking, someone should write a book about this. No one's ever written a book about this. Ended up being the book I wrote.
Send Mark a copy,
And
Mike.
I will.
Yeah, very good book. Very good. That's how we met. Yeah.
What? Now I don't want to change gears too quickly, but there is something now Mark mentioned Kathleen Rayne earlier. And I remember that, I'm sure Mark has a copy of Blake and Tradition 2-volume set, which I, as a 23 or 24-year-old, I had to save up money to get that. They had it at a used bookstore for, I don't know, $80, even way back then. So I saved up my money and I bought this used copy of Blake and Tradition, which, Kathleen Rayne, I think, showed me how to be a literary critic. Because she, in my English degrees, literary criticism was basically ripping on the dead white men. It was deconstructive. But here's Kathleen Rayne with this almost Coleridgean kind of approach to showing us the wonders that are inside of poetry. And now, we mentioned Jesus the Imagination, the journal I edit, which when the first one came out, so this is 6 years ago, I maybe a few months after it came out, I received a gift in the mail, which was a copy of Temenus. Is that, if I pronouncing that correctly? Which I don't know how, but somehow Jesus the Imagination got into their hands, and I think at the time it also got into Prince Charles's hands. And Prince Charles, now King Charles, right, is somebody you would think, at least in my long history of knowing about him, would be all in on what we're talking about right now. And in fact, when Marygrove College Raised Work closed, I was looking for a new job. One of the first places I applied was the Prince's Trust. But I don't know if they hire Americans, or they can, but I would have moved to take that job because, I don't know if Mark knows, but I'm a biodynamic farmer. And the king himself is a kind of a promoter of biodynamic farming. So to segue from William Blake to current events, where do you see the new king in terms of these kinds of things we're talking about? And
are you aware Mark has a video about this, Michael?
I'm not.
No, but you struck on a great chord. So Marco, I can know, is eminently prepared to talk about this, though, but still exploring yourself. Like, we're all hopeful. Go, Mark. I'm curious too.
Yeah, look, with the big proviso that I don't actually know what's going on in the mind of King Charles.
Yeah, right.
But nonetheless, the piece there was because Kathleen Rayne, I think you can fairly say, was a sort of spiritual director to the then Prince Charles. And he met her when he was relatively young, and he was really struck by her, partly because she said to him, not Your Majesty or something, but said, "You poor boy." And it was like he felt seen, probably not for the first time, but he certainly felt very seen by her. And then they struck up this relationship, which includes lots of letters. And when Kathleen Rayne died in 2003, Prince Charles organized a commemoration service, a celebration of her life, and gave the eulogy. And the eulogy was subsequently published in Resurgence magazine. And it's very remarkable because he talks about his relationship with her and what she told him. And a lot of it is based on Blake. Broadly the Blakean realization that we've turned the world into a material possession and so have lost its spiritual radiance. And I think that whilst, this has definitely informed a lot of what Prince Charles did. There's the Prince's Trust. There's also, is it called the Prince's School, which is for kind of traditional crafts and so on. And then the Temenos Academy itself, which Kathleen Rayne founded. And as Kathleen Rayne put it very neatly, the point of the Temenos Academy is not to learn about figures like Blake, it's to learn from figures like Blake. And that is completely different from most academic approaches. And then Prince Charles was the key patron And if you give a talk at the Temenos Academy, which I've done, apparently Prince Charles, I don't know whether he will now he's king, but listens to them, much like Jesus the Imagination. The journal gets into his hands too. But I mean, I sense that now he's king, he will realize that he's got to play the symbolic role and of a constitutional monarch. Because if he doesn't do that, then he doesn't just put himself at threat, but he puts the whole monarchy at threat. But at the same time, of course, playing a symbolic role is precisely a way to foster an awakening, because you awaken people to the sense that there's more than just policy. There's more than just economic conditions to worry about. There's more than just the practicalities of life, even more than how you farm, even more than how you make things. Because at the end of the day, those things become sustainable when you're in touch with that more. And so I think that he'll probably opt for a path that might frustrate some, because he won't speak out anymore. It'll frustrate other people who will think that he's thinking things in private, isn't he? And so on. But I think that actually it's quite a wise strategy, because if he can fully inhabit what a constitutional monarch might represent and just keep the rumor alive, if you like, that there's other worlds that are also here, that somehow a monarchy without power in a political sense can help remind us of, I think he'll have done a really good job, in fact, now that he is king.
Let me take another level to this then. And again, I'm just thinking out loud, is that you have, so Novalis, has that wonderful, those reflections, the king and queen, well, love and faith, the king and queen, and very much had a revolutionary, if symbolic, role for royalty, if we could find this. So there's revolutionary people, part of this podcast, Mark, and YouTube is kind of an anarchist impulse too, and so we know what maybe Kathleen Rayne thought, but what would William Blake have thought, to be in the States and watch this whole thing transpire? I've got this notion that that in some sense, the way the people were looking at the king, and possibly even you, struck me as what Blake would call religion or something, the disease that needs to be cured. Because Blake, again, he just didn't want it out there. He wanted it in us. And I'm not claiming to see this clearly, but, we have Kathleen Rayne, we have William Blake, we have, go at this one more time, on that. Like, couldn't William F. Blake possibly just said, like, this whole thing is so much nonsense? I don't know.
No, I mean, he was definitely an anti-monarchist. There's no two ways about it.
Okay.
And, he lived in Georgian England when the excesses of monarchy were all too evident. And moreover, it wasn't just that people had a kind of religious deferential attitude towards it, but as he puts it, it was religion hidden in war, which is even worse. And there was the Napoleonic Wars going on, and of course he gets into trouble with a soldier at one point in his life, and is accused of treason. No, definitely, I mustn't conceal that. But I think that Blake was also, he's a very dynamic thinker. And so I would like to think that were he addressing these political questions now, he might see, after 200 years of experimenting with various kinds of nonconformist, both religion and politics, which he, related to, and sort of, he knew figures like Thomas Paine and so on, and Mary Wollstonecraft. I think that he might feel that the intervention that we need now is different. And so, the reason why he's an anti-monarchist, put it like this, so it doesn't sound like special pleading, or at least less like special pleading. The reason why he's an anti-monarchist is because he thinks that we need to awaken to the monarchy within us.
Absolutely.
He has various phrases where he says, I am a prince of the world, and what he means by that is very deeply connected to becoming aware of our own divinity. And the human divine, and he thinks that in a deferential world that gets taken out of us, as you're saying, that the deference, the divinity goes on to those special others, be they priests, be they royalty. But I think certainly when it comes to the royalty as it's now become, there's the possibility at least that a figure who's above a politics that has increasingly reached into every single part of our lives, much, much more so than in the Georgian periods. I think we forget now quite easily how much technology particularly has enabled political control, but also, it's political hope and aspiration too. Again, it's always complicated because many people do it with goodwill, but it shapes, almost every part of our life now. And I think that the value of someone who symbolically, absolutely not exercising power, because the minute they started exercising power would mean they got caught up in the nexus of politics, can remind us that, politics will not build heaven on earth. And, much like religion will not build heaven on earth. And that feels to me to be, valuable. Now, I'm not a monarchist in the sense that, if we were starting from scratch, I'd be calling for a monarchy. But given that in this country, at least, we have this constitutional monarchy and the way that it's evolved, I feel pragmatically it's worth, giving it a really good go, because I think it can stand for these sacred things.
Yeah.
You're the best. That was great. No, I just love it.
Yeah. So the one thing that's disturbed me about the former prince, the king formerly known as Prince, is his, over the last few years, his kind of chumminess with the World Economic Forum, which, to me, that was a tremendous letdown, because I had so much admiration for what he was doing for such a long time, for decades, really. And I wonder what Blake how Blake would see that. I'm sure he would not be a fan.
Well, let me add the symbolic element too, is that there's this blogger Michael and I both like, John Michael Greer. We'll have him on sometime. He writes in the US under the Archdruid, Eco Sophia, it's a blog. He's always kind of spot on, but he conjectures that this image of, the elites kind of flying their private jets to Davos to lecture us on the environment might be the actual thing that would start a worldwide revolution, right? Because the symbol is so egregious, so horrifying, the private jets, and then they tell the Norwegians not to eat hamburgers and so forth. But just to give it like what Michael was saying, in this kind of symbolic nugget, that if, we see the prince does that. I haven't followed which jets are there, but we know the princes do that. They fly in, then everybody comes over to the States and lectures us that eating a hamburger is going to kill the environment. This relates to two things you do well, which is William Blake, Mark, but also how these states of awareness that we began with affect the way we see the environmental movement and ecology. So I think there's a lot you can offer us here.
Maybe.
I love your humility.
I mean, people do say this about Charles and the World Economic Forum, and I half get it. But I think Charles is quite a pragmatic thinker. He has the vision, but he doesn't confuse that with the policy. And that's always the risk, which I think we increasingly run now, is that the way that I often think of it is we've got to constantly remember that heaven is not a place on earth. Heaven comes after death, whether that's the dying every day now or our ultimate deaths. And it's certainly part of generation to get confused with material assessments of what people are doing and think that's what really counts more than anything. So I obviously, on one level, I completely get the image of the private jets flying to Davos, but the huge risk is that you judge the world by material criteria, and then you're just in that same mess as well, thinking you're talking about spiritual things. And so I half get the concern with the World Economic Forum, but I half think that if you get too worried about that, then you're getting dragged down, actually. This one of the ways in which Blake is also quite difficult, especially with ecological crisis now, is he's an apocalyptic thinker. He's quite clear this world will pass away. He doesn't think that this world is the world to preserve. Rather, This world is the place where we can learn to resonate and know the more than this world, of which this world is a wonderful manifestation when we see it aright. But, you know, dying and death, and this is one of the ways in which he's very Christian too, is integral to that perception.
Now let's stop there. Do
yeah,
the
okay.
4 generations with dying and death. It's really, really good. So, you know, begin us at Ulro, the way people in Ulro perceive death.
Yeah, so in Ulro, this is my kind of summary. You know, death is just statistics, and we had this a lot during COVID. You know, where the news programs, the newspapers, or whatever, even had kind of banners with the number of people that had died that day. And the point about that is that I know that in a way it's trying to be humanitarian, because it's trying to awaken us to the seriousness of the problem, but it just leaves everybody in increasing sort of states of panic.
Yeah, I do. One anecdote is I remember talking to a friend from college one time, and he was mentioning back when you had the war in Rwanda and Burundi. You know, he remembered fixing his muesli in the morning and watching, you know, all these bodies float down the river. You know, and then you could read a newspaper report, but he himself felt that as numbing and even sending him further into what we would call Oro, you know.
Yeah. And then so death is a sort of mere statistic. Then in generation, that's where we feel the anxiety of death, because we want life. And so then you're caught in ever sort of more controlling efforts to if you know, ideally put death off indefinitely, which of course some people are working towards, but certainly to delay it as much as possible. And again, you kind of saw that driving so much of the public discussion in the worst moments of COVID. And once again, it you know, in retrospect, certainly you can see how it didn't really do us much good. I mean, look, I'm glad there are vaccines. I've had the vaccines, and I'm not saying that they're per se not bad, but when that kind of drive towards safety gets used to the point where all other factors about life start to get squeezed out and lost.
The cult of safety.
We're also now beginning to see post-COVID. You know, that's the generation state. And then though, you know, because we're loving, meaningful creatures, we actually can't tolerate that. So there's the Beulah state, and here is when death sort of softens and becomes a tragedy. It becomes something that really matters, hurts, the genuine sense of loss, but maybe also is the moment where we most keenly know about things like love as well, when someone dies. In the tragedy is a deep experience of life when it doesn't overwhelm. And so that would be the Beulah way of engaging with death. But then, you know, there's eternity. And in eternity, even as Blake puts it, what he calls eternal death is known to be held by eternal life. And by eternal death, he means that moment where you, at least I think this is what he means, you feel the possibility that maybe death is the end, that maybe there is emptiness. You fear the void, you fear the meaninglessness. Maybe you've suffered and you've reached a point where, for all you wish it were otherwise, you can't make sense of this suffering anymore. But Blake says that experience of eternal death will be known in eternity as embraced and held by eternal life. And, you know, this is where I'm cautious, because I don't know that myself. I hope for that myself, and I hope it guides me. But you know, the position of faith that others have seen this, people like Blake, I think people like John of the Cross as well, who you mentioned, and others, is that there will come a time when we'll know fully that death is a portal to the fullness of life.
Well, you know, I mean,
yeah,
I'm sure I know both of you know it, but probably many of our listeners do not. Is, you know, in, I think it was 1827, while William Blake was dying, it took him a while. He was very ill in August of, I think it was August 12th, I think it was. They were sitting at his bed, at his death watch, and all of a sudden, Blake, who had been very ailing and very weak, sat up and started singing about the glories he saw in heaven, and that's how he died. And I've always held that up as my model for how I would like to exit this life, because I've learned so much from William Blake about not only how to live but how to die.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. And sometimes I think the whole point of this mortal life is to learn how to die. And it's because it's not just what happens at the end, because if you wait till what happens at the end, it's probably going to be too late to die like that. But
Right.
I think death is something that accompanies life moment by moment, partly through the way we relate to others, so hence every kindness being a little death, that sort of little micro decenterings of ourself. But in other traditions, they'll focus on the breath, and they'll talk about the breath in being the taking in of life, and then the breath out being the letting go of life. And it's that pause at the bottom where something more starts to be perceived in that stillness. So in lots of ways, in psychotherapy, you think about it a lot, because often it's how people end things that something really important is revealed. How they end the session. Is there kind of a momentary anxiety, or can they not wait to get out of the room, or whatever it might be? If you can get those moments, you can start to see how people are frightened of endings. So in this way, death can, even in this life, you can start to feel how it does actually lead to more life, and without having to know the tremendous things that people like William Blake saw.
You have that video. Another one people could just search for is Mark Vernon, to die before dying, right? That's kind of the secret. I mentioned the Stephen Vizinci before. He has another tagline that he gave me, but it's to remind people that though we die once, we're immortal every day, right? And that's a way to bring in. I used to work at a Trappist monastery, to bring in the Ars Moriendi, to which they practice so well, to acknowledge that sleep is a little death, loss of memory, not to be able to conjure a memory is a form of death. But we need to make people aware of these, super, super important. So how about, one more theme, and I know you got to cut out in a little bit here, Mark. I think we've touched on these 4 levels as they applied to, say, the material universe. We certainly wove in ecology and death. You also did one on the way that different levels, Uro, generation, Beulah, and Eden eternity would look at freedom, and because a huge theme for Blake was tyranny, and so what constitutes tyranny? But I think, the way you unpack it using that schema again is very, very, very helpful.
I mean, maybe it's just worth prefacing this, because this almost
Sure.
came up. I was thinking it when we were talking about Blake and politics.
Please.
But I think he himself undergoes a development. In some ways, Blake is one of these figures that has one big idea, and he actually writes it down in a pithy form in his little book called There Is No Natural Religion, very early in his life. And then the rest of his life is a kind of working out of how to express that. But in another way, he does undergo a kind of development. And I think that his relationship to freedom is a bit like that, because I think for a while, particularly before the French Revolution, he did kind of hope for a political freedom that might be possible. And this is perhaps when he was associated in his early life with radicals like Thomas Paine. There's not I don't think there's really the material evidence to back that up, but you sort of sense that. But then I think he has a sort of personal crisis. He spends these 3 years in Sussex, and I guess hence the film reference there, the only time he's spent out of London. And at first that seemed like heaven on earth, but things went wrong in one way or another, including this altercation with a soldier, which might have led to, well, even to his execution, but certainly a real risk of him being carted off to Australia, which was a terrible punishment at the time. And
it would be.
Sorry. Yeah, but so I think then he in a way, you might say in one way, kind of loses faith with politics, but that in itself I think is an awakening to a deeper sense of possibility. on the other side of death known fully, but even now as well. And so, in the later poems, particularly these epics like Jerusalem, it's very striking that the figure of Jesus returns, in fact. It's in the moments of crisis that you realize that Christ is by your side, is often what happens in Jerusalem. Albion dies actually several times in Jerusalem, but each time kind of Jesus is there. And sometimes Jesus is building a bed for Albion, and then sometimes Jesus is welcoming Albion into the clouds. Various kinds of experiences that we might have in moments of crisis. And so the later Blake, there's much more of a sense of, we need to reach beyond this world, but it's also to be found right in the middle of this world as well. It's that combination you see in genuine mystics where the transcendent and the immanent are absolutely the same thing. So anyway, that's a bit of a preface to this thing about freedom.
An important one, yeah.
So I think freedom, freedom in Ulro is, again, it's kind of like a numerical thing. It's maybe like you're spending power, something like that. You're kind of, or even, again, it's always complicated because there's well-meaning metrics in this. So the way that relative poverty, I think, is used, kind of would be an Ulro assessment of freedom. It's not wholly bad. It is trying to capture something, but of course the trouble with relative levels of poverty is it gets caught on this kind of hedonic treadmill, and so the relative level of poverty constantly rises, it actually feeds the consumptive way of life that's actually causing the poverty. So there's Ulro would be that. In generation, freedom is much more about maybe your ability to exercise your will, put it like that. And so having a voice, which can be a good thing, of course, but also leads to culture wars because your freedom is going to compete with other people's freedom, and it turns into a kind of battle of wills and power. Therefore, then in Beulah, freedom is you might say the sort of freedom to give, and the freedom to love. Has more of a, well, in extremis it would be more of a kind of libertarian feel, but even more modestly it would be also the freedom, like the Good Samaritan, to kind of give away what you have for the benefit of others, and that's a state of freedom as well in Beulah. I think that's the meaning of the Good Samaritan. It's not that he was a morally good person, but that he was a free person and so could respond to what was in front of him.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. But then in eternity, freedom is the freedom not just to sort of give away what you have, but is to become aligned with, I'm using the Platonic phrase, the good, the beautiful, and the true. That is a kind of service, of course. At the end of Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, when Albion finally finds true freedom, he actually throws himself into the furnaces of affliction, Blake says, and they, in that moment, turned into fountains of living waters. And so it's that strange paradox that by giving up on your freedom, you find the true freedom, because you've become aligned with that which is truly free, which is the divine life.
And we see that in St. Francis of Assisi, embracing the leper. We see it in St. Vincent de Paul, selling himself into slavery. Very, very, very beautiful. And before we ask you to kind of like pitch your works and everything, Mark, let me say that like your intelligence, your generosity of spirit, the clarity and everything, it's really quite overwhelming to me, and again, like you're the right person on Blake for this time. Michael, I'm sure you have another question.
No, just an observation and an appreciation for what Mark brought to our attention. And I think this is, you see this as a problem throughout academia that scholars want their subject to have always been static. And even like Rudolf Steiner, people want him to have always been the same person. And Blake, always the same person, but development is an important thing. And the William Blake of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell is a very different William Blake from Jerusalem. Not even, and it's an interesting, when I I mean, I love the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, but when I read it, I think of myself when I was 30 and I thought I knew everything. And Blake is kind of in that register. He's much wiser than I ever was. But in Jerusalem, he's suffered, as Mark said. And I think the key to unlocking that freedom from slavery in Jerusalem, anyway, is forgiveness. And it's also forgiveness of the self, not just forgiveness of others. So thank you so much, Mark, for your wisdom in our conversation.
I must add that I long for these things, and that's why I try and wrestle with them. And that one of the things actually which Blake is giving me quite a lot at the moment, actually, which is when you think about how present, like weeping and wailing and darkness and despair, and all these, and anger and rage even is present even in the late work like Jerusalem. And and often it's the figure of loss that is engaged in these tremendous feelings and emotions. And loss is sometimes said to be the figure of imagination, and so perhaps the closest to Blake the person. You don't want to be too neat and tidy about it, but there's something in that, I think. But anyway, the point is that I think even at the late stage, Blake knew a lot about weeping and despair and anger, but what's wonderful is he builds that into this process of awakening as well. And I think that maybe that's just another sort of take on freedom, actually, is when, and I say this to myself as a religious person, somehow I can know that too is part of the process. And so not be afraid of all that as well, and try to avoid it and spiritually bypass it or whatever. That's a tremendous lesson in itself.
Wow. So obviously Michael and I can say we've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. You're a busy guy. You don't have to say yes or no now, but boy, another conversation on the secret history of Christianity down the road somewhere, people would profit. But tell people how you would like them to approach you and your work, and how to find out, how to buy your books, and again, access points for your stuff on William Blake.
Yeah, look, I mean, just to say that I love to talk again. I love talking about these things because it's in the sharing that you feel it as much as when you're just reading Blake on your own. So it's lovely to talk with you guys that want these things too, and have dedicated lives to them. And also to say, actually, just in terms of talking again, I'd be very happy to do that about Barfield, but I want you also to talk about Steiner to me. This is the deal. I'm very happy to talk about Barfield and Christianity, but I want you to talk about Steiner, because for those who are listening, Barfield, I think, found his vision by his own means, but then he encountered Steiner and felt that Steiner had seen it all the more.
And really odd, right? Insofar as
Steiner, I will say, straight up.
But the connection there can't be avoided, right? We have, when you say so many people look at Blake and don't want to see the spiritual in it. Like for some of us who read Steiner, and enough having read Barfield wouldn't say he was like a drop in a bucket compared to Steiner. He was a drop in a crazy gushing geyser, right? So Barfield scholars, and so we have Steinerians who avoid Steiner's relationship with Jesus. We have Barfieldians who avoid his relationship with Steiner, and all this stuff. So we'd be happy to have you on and talk about that, or be on something you do. But Steiner is very important to us.
Yeah, well, I'd love to tease some of that out, because I mean, in my book on Barfield and Christianity, I have actually changed it in a second edition because it was a failing of mine, but I didn't even mention Steiner once, and it was because I just didn't know what to do with it. But in my defense, also, although Barfield would make these comments about Steiner and his tremendousness, I think that Barfield's at his best when he's talking in his own way.
I agree.
When he's not trying to channel Steiner. And it's very rare, I feel, that you find someone who you feel is talking about the same things as Steiner, but knowing it themselves, rather than just quoting Steiner. So that's kind of that's my challenge to you.
Yeah, from most anthroposophists.
Yeah. So this grouping has a bright future. Mark, a little more direction. I definitely want. Can you promote your books? The Dante one is new. People find it. Where would you like them to buy that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I have this website, markvernon.com, where I try and make sure everything's there. But we could have another conversation on Dante. I mean, I wrote this book, Dante's Divine Comedy, a guide for the spiritual journey, and a bit like trying to open up Blake, the idea is that it opens up the Divine Comedy, because again, it's very much a book for our times. I think Dante's quite clear about that. He's not the kind of culmination of the medieval period. He realized that was already breaking down, and he wanted to write for the future.
Yeah.
And it's similar to Blake in the sense that he realized that perceptual transformation is absolutely key. And so that's one way of understanding the journey through the Inferno and the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. So anyway, Dante is a wonderful guide for our times, quite as much as Blake too.
Great. So looking forward to a bright future. Thanks so much. You were traveling yesterday and you showed up today. You could have been tired, but you seemed like you were more than on top of your game. And, blessings upon you. And we hope you have a good day. And we thank everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We're going to see you all again next week.